The map of the world just broke, and most Americans have no idea what's actually happening or why it matters to their grocery bill, their gas pump, and the dollar in their pocket. Right now, in 2026, something is unfolding in the Persian Gulf that is rewriting the rules of naval power, global trade, and American dominance in ways that haven't been seen since the 1970s oil shock. We are watching a moment in history where the technology of cheap swarming drones and GPS-killing electronic warfare has created what military analysts and shipping experts are quietly calling a dead zone, a stretch of water where the world's most expensive warships are being repositioned away from the most dangerous corridor on the planet. And at the center of this story is a Russian-engineered drone system called the GERAN-5, Iran's access to swarm warfare tactics, and the Strait of Hormuz that went from carrying roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil to handling just 6 ship transits per day in March 2026, down from 130. That is a collapse of 95%. Think about that number for a second. 95%. And yet the American conversation has barely scratched the surface of what this truly means, who benefits, who suffers, and where the new lines of global power are actually being drawn. That is exactly what we are going to walk through today. Let's start where we always have to start when we want to understand a geopolitical shift, the physical reality on the ground, or in this case, on the water. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage, only 21 miles wide at its tightest point, sitting between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. That strip of ocean has, for decades, been the jugular vein of the global economy. Before February 28th of this year, roughly 20 million barrels of oil passed through it every single day, about 20% of the world's entire oil consumption, around 20% of global liquefied natural gas, 1/3 of the world's fertilizer inputs, helium for hospitals, paraxylene for plastics, steel components. Nearly half the aluminum arriving at the ports of New York and Houston came through that narrow channel. So when that channel effectively closed, it was not just a shipping story, it was a supply chain earthquake that hit every sector of the American economy simultaneously, and the aftershocks are still moving. Now here is where the drone technology angle becomes impossible to separate from the larger story. The GERAN-5 is a Russian-developed jet-powered Kamikaze drone, a successor to the GERAN-2, which itself was Russia's version of the Iranian Shahed 136. What makes the GERAN-5 genuinely different from anything that came before it is its guidance architecture. It is not just satellite-guided. It combines satellite navigation with cellular backup, giving it accuracy within less than 10 meters, even in environments where GPS is being actively jammed. Russian engineers built this system precisely because they watched Ukraine develop electronic warfare countermeasures against earlier drone generations and concluded that sole reliance on satellite guidance was a vulnerability they could no longer afford. The result is a weapon that can find and strike individual storage tanks, radar installations, and yes, ships, with a precision that earlier loitering munitions could not achieve. And the exchange ratio, the cost to the attacker versus the cost to the defender, is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who has thought seriously about American naval doctrine. A single GERAN-5 costs somewhere between $100,000 and $300,000 to build. The interceptor missiles fired to stop it can cost millions per shot. You can do that math in your head and understand immediately why the economics of drone warfare are breaking every assumption the Pentagon built its force structure around. But here is the piece that most coverage misses entirely. The GERAN-5 is not operating in isolation. What happened in the Persian Gulf after February 28th was a multi-dimensional electronic warfare environment unlike anything commercial shipping had ever encountered. Hours after the first American and Israeli strikes on Iran, data analytics firms watching ship tracking feeds observed vessels in the Persian Gulf making completely impossible movements, container ships were showing up as traveling over land, tankers appeared to be making sharp turns through perfect geometric polygons in the middle of open water. This was GPS spoofing on a massive scale, the transmission of counterfeit satellite navigation signals that overwhelm a ship's ability to know where it actually is. Since mid-2025, there had already been growing reports of this kind of interference near the Strait of Hormuz, but after the war began, it became total and pervasive. Spreading across the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the North Arabian Sea, the US Navy had to issue a maritime warning zone covering that entire region and explicitly stated it could not guarantee the safety of neutral or merchant vessels operating within it. When you put these two things together, the physical threat of swarming drones and the electronic warfare that blinds navigation systems, you begin to understand why the term dead zone is not an exaggeration. It is a zone where the conventional playbook of naval superiority runs into serious and documented trouble. And this is where the carrier question becomes genuinely fascinating rather than just a Pentagon budget argument. The USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Abraham Lincoln have both been operating in this theater, conducting hundreds of sorties a day against Iranian infrastructure as part of Operation Epic Fury. They are not in the Persian Gulf itself. They are operating from the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, using aerial refueling tankers staged at Ben Gurion Airport in Israel to extend the range of their air wings far enough to strike targets in Iran. The carriers are not sailing into the Gulf. That choice is not accidental. It reflects exactly the kind of operational calculus that the drone revolution is forcing on American naval planners. Think about what that position reveals. The US Navy has positioned its most powerful assets outside the zone where Iran's asymmetric weapons are densest. A carrier strike group is protected by layers of Aegis-equipped destroyers, interceptor missiles, electronic warfare aircraft, close-in weapon systems, and fighter jets that can intercept drones beyond the radar horizon of surface ships. And yet the Navy is still keeping those carriers well away from the Persian Gulf itself. The reason is that in the confined waters of the Gulf, the kill chain dynamics change fundamentally. The strait is only 21 miles wide. Reaction time collapses. The layered defense systems that work well in open ocean become compressed into something much harder to manage when a swarm of Shahed 136 variants and next-generation GERAN derivatives are launched from coastal sites a few miles away. Iran launched more than 2,000 low-cost one-way attack drones into the Gulf region in the first 6 days of the war alone. The UAE intercepted 125 of 131 detected drones in a single exchange. That is an impressive intercept rate, but 6 drones still got through. Against a carrier, 6 hits in one engagement can be operationally devastating even if they cannot sink the ship, and the adversary only has to succeed once. There is a second dimension to the carrier repositioning story that almost nobody in mainstream American media is connecting properly. The U.S. Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, which has been the anchor of American naval presence in the Gulf for decades, was quietly reduced to fewer than 100 mission-critical personnel in late February. Satellite imagery confirmed that all U.S. ships based in Bahrain had left port before the strikes on Iran began. That is the United States voluntarily withdrawing its most visible symbol of Gulf presence in advance of a conflict it was about to start. The Gulf allies themselves, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, had already blocked the United States from using their bases and airspace for direct strikes on Iran because they were terrified of Iranian retaliation. And those fears were justified. Iranian drones struck Camp Beering in Kuwait. They struck Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Iranian ballistic missiles hit Gulf energy infrastructure. The IRGC fired on an Indian-flagged supertanker even though that vessel held a prior Iranian transit clearance. The operating environment inside the Gulf has become genuinely hostile to everything that floats, regardless of flag. Now step back and look at what all of this means for the global economy, because this is where the story stops being about warships and becomes deeply personal for every American household. The International Energy Agency described the Strait of Hormuz closure as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That is not hyperbole written for effect. Oil prices surged to $150 per barrel at their peak in March, the highest level in 4 years, and the largest monthly price increase ever recorded. Brent crude was trading around $130 at the time of writing. The Dallas Fed put out research calculating that even a single quarter of Hormuz closure would reduce global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. UNCTAD projected global merchandise trade growth would fall from 4.7% in 2025 to somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5% in 2026. These numbers translate into higher prices for everything from plastics to food to the electricity powering your home, because so many supply chains run through or depend on energy sourced through that channel. The fertilizer dimension alone deserves more attention than it gets. About 1/3 of the world's internationally traded fertilizer normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz. When that channel closes, the cost of producing food everywhere on the planet goes up. The Persian Gulf produces roughly 8% of the world's aluminum, including 40% of America's waterborne aluminum imports. Nearly half the aluminum arriving at the ports of New York and Houston came from that region. American manufacturers making everything from cars to aerospace components to consumer electronics are facing real supply chain disruption right now because of what is happening in those waters. And yet the news cycle in this country has largely treated the Gulf crisis as a military story with geopolitical subtext, rather than as the economic emergency it also very clearly is. There is one more piece of this puzzle that deserves honest examination, and it is the piece that tends to make powerful people uncomfortable when someone brings it up. The decision to strike Iran on February 28th was presented to the American public through a very specific frame: nuclear weapons, regime brutality, protecting allies. All of those elements are real, but what is also real is that the outcome of that decision has produced the largest oil supply shock in recorded history, has forced about 2,000 ships and 20,000 mariners into a stranded situation in the Persian Gulf, has caused Kuwait and Iraq to cut their own oil production because their storage is full and they cannot export, has pushed European gas benchmarks toward levels that threaten technical recession across the continent, and has created what one UN agency called a grocery supply emergency in the Gulf states themselves, where more than 80% of caloric intake was imported through the strait. The world is now watching whether the ceasefire announced in mid-April holds, whether the US mine-clearing operation in the strait succeeds, whether the negotiations between Washington and Tehran produce a path back to normal shipping flows, or whether we are entering a longer era of fragmented maritime trade where certain flags can pass, others cannot, and the old assumption of free and open sea lanes enforced by American naval dominance is being renegotiated in real time. China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iraq, and Malaysia all received special transit permissions from Iran while the strait was officially closed. The United States and its allies did not. That is not just a military outcome, that is a geopolitical signal about who holds leverage in the Gulf in a world where cheap drones, GPS spoofing, and asymmetric naval tactics can neutralize the most expensive weapon systems ever built. The GERAN-5 Deadzone is not just a patch of dangerous water, it is a mirror showing us the emerging shape of a world where American power still exists, is still formidable, but is being forced to operate further back, at greater expense, with less certainty about the rules than at any point since the end of the Cold War.